Today, for our first session, we're going to be talking about federal regulations and good clinical practices. This is a huge topic. It's going to take us two classes to cover all the material. Today, we will talk about good clinical practice definition, purpose, history, what the components are of GCPs, how GCPs address the issue of clinical protocols, developing clinical protocols, informed consent, IRB review, responsibilities of clinical investigators, sponsors, study initiation, and then we'll touch on data management. And then next week, we're going to try to cover the other topics, which are adverse event reporting, sponsor monitoring, clinical supplies, study closure, record retention. Importantly, on the right side, essential documents needed for a study regulatory file. I think a lot of research investigators and staff are not quite sure what they need in their regulatory file, so we're going to provide you with a list that will be helpful to you. We will talk about audits. We'll give you an introductory discussion about sponsor and FDA audits, a little bit more about where you can get training in good clinical practices. And this is an add-on. It doesn't really fall exactly under good clinical practices, but we will talk about the new regulations regarding transportation of biologic samples. First of all, a very basic slide here. What are good clinical practices? This is the definition that's now recognized both nationally and internationally. And it's a standard for the design, the conduct, the performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analyses, and reporting of clinical trials that provides assurance that the data and the reported results are credible and accurate, and that the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of the trial subjects are protected. So you can tell from that definition there's two basic pillars of good clinical practices. One is the protection of subject rights, and one is the promotion of data integrity. And this is really the gold standard now for conducting clinical research. I remember I've been in clinical research now for, I think, 18 years. And I remember a time when we didn't have a concept such as good clinical practices. But nowadays, you know, if you're conducting clinical research, you can no longer plead ignorance about good clinical practices. They are the standard now. Why are they important for you? First of all, as we've already said, they are the current national and international standard. Both the research industry and the federal government have incorporated good clinical practices into their operating procedures for conducting research. Study sites that show that they're familiar with and have trained their personnel in good clinical practices indicates to others that they're using high standards for conducting clinical research. And last but not least, you will be held to these standards during monitoring visits and in the event that you're audited either by the federal government or from a pharmaceutical company sponsor. There's a long history to development of good clinical practices. They weren't just developed in isolation. And as with many things, sometimes good things come out of bad. So there have been some unfortunate things that have happened in our history that have led to these laws and these new guidelines. The Food and Drug Law of 1906 really resulted from the public response to a book by Upton Sinclair about the jungle and the atrocities in the meat packing plants. And there was also a public response at that time to several dangerous and addictive additives that were included in patented medications. And so this was really the first federally mandated effort to control food and drugs. Unfortunately, this first law had a lot of loopholes and low fines for offenders, and so there was a lot of ways to get around it. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Law of 1938 was a result of some very unfortunate episodes where several people died, many children, due to manufacturer mixing ethylene glycol, which is antifreeze, with elixir sulfonamide. They were trying to come up with a new elixir, and many individuals died. And so this law then brought into light needing more information about product safety, and they called for results from animal and clinical trials. And also this was the first attempt to set forth requirements for new drug applications. You might know that term, NDA, new drug applications. The Kefauver-Harris amendments were another group of measures in 1962. These resulted from a review of a new drug application for thalidomide in 1961. As you probably remember, the drug had been used in Europe for morning sickness and insomnia. And during FDA investigation, it was found that over 3,500 babies had been born with congenital deformities and seal limbs. And so these amendments called for specific safety data, additional safety data, and stated that a trial could not start until all of this data was pulled together and submitted. And these amendments really sought to better improve protection to human subjects in clinical studies, as well as to improve the data regarding drug safety and effectiveness. As we go down the line here, and you can see more elements of the GCP history, we've got some of the ethical documents that have arisen from sort of abuses in the area of research, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report. And then last but not least, we have the International Conference on Harmonization Good Clinical Practice Guideline. And a lot of people don't really know what ICH means. It's got kind of not a very good ring to it, but they're spelled out for you. And this is basically a conference. This was an attempt by pharmaceutical companies to bring together their efforts from many countries. They first started meeting in, I believe, 1990. And the purpose was to develop a consensus among countries regarding what the requirements were for conducting clinical trials and submitting data to support licensure. In the past, each country sort of had their own requirements. And the pharmaceutical companies felt that if they could develop a high standard that everyone could follow, that some data could be accepted by more than one country. So another purpose of ICH was to harmonize efforts to help reduce drug development expense and duplication. For the pharmaceutical company, this meant hopefully mutual acceptance of data in several countries, a reduction in drug development time, and a reduction in the cost and use of resources. Now, for the drug regulatory agencies such as FDA, this meant that new drug applications would be provided in a more standard format. Hopefully the review time would be shortened, and hopefully the expertise and credibility of investigators would be more assured. This is a schematic of the composition of the International Conference on Harmonization. There's 3 major components. Probably the one that you'd be most interested in are the co-sponsors, United States, Japan, and the European Union. And within the United States, there's representatives from 2 major agencies, the Food and Drug Administration and PhRMA. There's also ICH observers from Canada, WHO, the European Free Trade Area, and then a lot of pharmaceutical manufacturer representatives. I believe they meet once a year, and they rotate countries where they meet. They have, since 1990, developed a series of guidelines for the conduct of clinical studies and for preclinical studies. they divided them into 4 areas: quality topics, efficacy topics, safety topics, and then multidisciplinary, which is kind of a grab bag. The ones that we'll be looking at today fall under E for efficacy, and specifically we're going to delve further into the E6 guidelines for good clinical practices. But if you're ever interested, there's also guidelines for obtaining data in special populations, statistical principles for clinical trials. I think we handed that one out last year. Choice of control group. So there's some very, very good guidelines there. Down in the multidisciplinary topics, you've got medical terminology, electronic standards for submission of data, and some other very good topics there too. All these can be found on the ICH website. They're all downloadable, easy to obtain. Okay, just going back to sort of some of the things that go into good clinical practices. First, the Code of Federal Regulations. And as you probably know, the code is law. This is the law that we abide by in the research world. And these, they're listed as titles. Title 21 pertains to any work done under FDA jurisdiction. And then Title 45 pertains to studies done under Health and Human Services jurisdiction. Sometimes you're working under both. I know that we do studies with NIH support that involve investigational new drugs, and so we're subject to regulations under Title 21 and Title 45. But these are the basic Code of Federal Regulations that are included in your binder. When you see, I'm not sure how familiar you are with these terms, but you might see it written 21 CFR 11, and that would refer to this FDA regulation for electronic records. So that's probably how you'd see it documented. There's other components that make up GCPs, or good clinical practices. There's guidelines, there's guidances, there's information sheets. The FDA has come out with information sheets that represents their current thinking on how to interpret their code. So going back to our 2 main components of good clinical practices, we've got our human subjects protections and we have our data integrity. And these are basically the supports that help support these 2 principles. Again, all of this is very accessible on the web. Here are some of the websites that you can look up. You can look up www.fda.gov, regsource.com, ich.org, or nih.gov. Those are very easy to access. So going back to the International Conference on Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice, here's the timeline. Basically, FDA had published drafts of 2 documents. One was guidelines for the investigator brochure, and then guideline for essential documents for the conduct of a clinical study. And those were published these were in draft form, and they were published in 1994 in the Federal Register. And in 1995, the FDA published a draft of good clinical practices in the Federal Register. And then in a little bit later, close to 1996, these 3 guidelines were consolidated into one. It became the Good Clinical Practice Consolidated Guidance. It was considered and endorsed by the International Conference on Harmonization April 30th, 1996. It was accepted by the FDA and effective May 7th, 1997. And basically this provides public assurance that the rights, well-being, and confidentiality of trial subjects are protected and that the trial data are credible. And again, there are copies in your course manual. I don't know if you can see this. This is the Harmonized Good Clinical Practice Guideline. This is actually what it looked like, May 1996. And this is the Federal Register from May 9th, 1997, and that's also in your handbook, your handouts. If you look at the ICH GCP guidelines, these are the contents. This is the table of contents. Good clinical practices really do address various steps in the clinical trial process. They address topics about what to do before your enrollment of subjects, what to do during subject enrollment, and then at the conclusion of the study. So before enrollment of subjects, GCPs address issues such as the design of the protocol and the case report form, the assessment of available subjects and the feasibility of the study, and obtaining IRB approval. And then, of course, during subject enrollment, there's guidelines for recruiting and obtaining written informed consent, administering treatments and interventions, performing study procedures, monitoring subject progress, collecting and recording data, and reporting safety information. And then GCPs at the conclusion of the study address topics such as how to analyze the data and report results, and what to do about archiving study records. We're going to start with the first topic, which we skipped past the glossary. Hopefully you can pick up the glossary information from your notebook. We're going to skip right over to some of the principles. And again, it just reiterates that the rights, safety, and well-being of trial subjects are the most important considerations and must prevail over interests of science and society. So this puts subject safety first. Clinical trials should be scientifically sound and described in a clear, detailed protocol. Each individual involved in conducting a clinical trial should be qualified by education, training, and experience to perform his or her respective task. We'll move then on to protocol content. These are the places where you can find the guidelines about protocol content. And the reason I wanted to include some of the elements of protocol content is I do participate in a couple of different committees here and have a chance to review many protocols. And it is surprising to see how many protocols don't contain some of these basic elements. And if you find yourself in the position of having to write a protocol or review a protocol, you know, you could pull out the ICH GCP guidelines and just hold it up next to your protocol and probably check off some of the items to make sure you have everything. But the protocol must contain a detailed description of the objectives and the purpose of the trial. It seems easy and second nature, but not always. We don't always see that. The trial design, the scientific integrity of the trial, and the credibility of the data depend on the trial design. You must include primary and secondary endpoints to be measured. Specify the type of trial design. Is this a double-blind or placebo-controlled trial? What measures are you taking to minimize or avoid bias, such as randomization and blinding? The dosing regimen of your investigational product, the expected duration of each subject's participation. This is an important one that sometimes is missing. Stopping rules, not only for individual subjects, but for parts of the trial and the entire trial. Maintenance of randomization codes, procedures for breaking the codes, subject inclusion and exclusion criteria, and subject withdrawal criteria. Going on here, the protocol needs to include procedures for reporting adverse events, for assessing, recording, and analyzing safety, the description of the statistical methods that you plan to use, including any interim analyses that are planned. And another item that's sometimes missing from protocols is a description of how the sample size was obtained, what calculations were used, and what the justifications are. A description of how subjects will be selected and which ones will be included in the analyses, criteria for termination of the trial, and then, of course, ethical considerations. Hoping that we have a protocol in place, let's move on to informed consent. Of course, this is a talk that Dr. Laidlaw usually gives, but the purpose of the informed consent is to inform and protect the rights and safety of human subjects in clinical trials. And good clinical practices for informed consent can be found in these locations. Here are some of the guidelines I picked out that I thought were important. The language used in the oral and written informed consent should be as non-technical and as practical and should be understandable to the subject. Before informed consent may be obtained, the investigator should provide the subject ample time and opportunity to inquire about details of the trial and decide whether or not to participate in the trial. Prior to participation in the trial, the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative should receive a copy of the signed and dated consent form and any other written information provided to the subjects. I will point out that this is one place where ICH slightly differs from FDA regulations, and that is ICH says that you must provide a copy of the signed and dated consent form as is. FDA regulations only specify that a copy of the consent be provided to the subject. Moving on with some of the required elements. Both the informed consent discussion and the written informed consent form and any written information to be provided to the subjects should include explanations of the following: that the trial involves research. You must let the subject know that they're participating in research. The purpose of the trial treatment, and the probability of random assignment to each treatment arm. The trial procedures to be followed, including all invasive procedures. What are the subject's responsibilities? What parts of the trial are experimental? It should be clearly stated. And I think that's a nice thing about our consent form here. There is a header that says the following procedures are experimental. And we have to answer that question when we're writing our consent form here. Foreseeable risks or inconveniences to the subject, and when applicable to the embryo, fetus, or nursing infants. Reasonably expected benefits, and if there is no intended clinical benefit to the subject, they need to be made aware of that. That needs to be included. The informed consent needs to include alternative procedures that may be available to the subject and their risks and benefits. Compensation or treatment available to the subject in the event of a trial-related injury. Anticipated prorated payment. Anticipated expenses, if any, to the subject. And that the subject's participation in the trial is voluntary, and they may refuse to participate or withdraw from the trial at any time without penalty or loss of benefits. That the monitor, the auditors, the IRB, and the regulatory authorities will be granted access to the subject's original medical records to verify clinical trial procedures or data without violating the confidentiality of the subject to the extent permitted by applicable laws and regulations. And that by signing a written informed consent form, the subject is authorizing such access. And that's the actual wording out of the ICH guideline. That the records identifying the subject will be kept confidential and will not be made publicly available. If the results of the trial are published, that the subject's identity will remain confidential. And that the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative will be informed in a timely manner if information becomes available that may be relevant to the subject's willingness to continue their participation. The informed consent should include contact information if they have questions regarding the trial, and also whom to contact in the event of a trial-related injury. What are some of the circumstances that may result under discontinuation of the subject's participation and the implications of that? The expected duration of their participation and the approximate number of subjects in the trial. It's quite a long list, but really, you should be able to go down this entire list and make sure that that's included in the consent form. what are some of the things that ICH does not specify that may be found elsewhere? One is that the person to call in the event of a research-related injury be different from the person to call regarding their rights as a research subject. Oftentimes this is a standard that's set by the institution and also by ethical considerations. The subject should have two different people to call if possible. Another topic that ICH does not address is the witness signature. This is an institutional procedure here at REI. Another topic is that each page of the consent must be initialed and dated by the subject. I see this a lot, and this is generally a sponsor requirement, but it may be an institutional requirement. It's not here at this time. And then finally, that the date and the version of the protocol be listed with the title on the consent. I think this is an awfully good idea. I highly recommend it, but it's not really addressed in the ICH guidelines. This is usually a sponsor institutional procedure. Okay. Are there any questions so far on protocols or informed consent? It's pretty basic. Carlos, yes.
How do you define experimental? I mean, what is the definition of experimental? Because that comes up a lot.
Right. It's generally defined as those procedures or drugs that are used outside of normal clinical care for the purpose of the research. And I know sometimes there's a gray line there.
Not the standard of care.
Right. Okay. The next topic we'll go through briefly is IRB review and approval. Of course, ICH does address this. The purpose is to ensure that the human subjects are not exposed to or asked to assume unnecessary risk, that they are aware of the potential risks and benefits of the study, and that they're informed of their rights as a research subject. And the guidelines for IRB review and approval can be found in several places. Here's your Title 21, which are your FDA regulations, and here's your Health and Human Services regulations, Title 45. Also, you can find this under OHRP. There's a lot of guidelines for IRB under OHRP. IRB approval must be obtained by the investigator prior to initiating any study activities. This includes recruitment and screening, and sometimes this topic comes up. You cannot begin screening, you cannot begin sending out recruitment letters or advertising until you have IRB approval. The approval must be written. You cannot go off of verbal approval. The IRB must have a valid assurance from OHRP, which is the Office of Human Research Protection, and they must generally operate in compliance with both the FDA and the HHS regulations. Any IRB member who's involved in the research that's being considered must abstain from voting. Okay, addressing IRB review and approval again, continuing review must occur annually. It can occur more often, especially if the IRB asks for it, but it must occur at least annually. IRBs must retain records for at least 3 years. IRBs must review and approve, if there's an asterisk by it, written informed consent, protocol and amendments before they're implemented, subject recruitment procedures and advertising, information about payment to subjects, written information that's provided to subjects, investigator brochure. Now that's not something the IRB can necessarily approve. That's coming from generally the sponsor, but they will review it. And then available safety information. The Good Clinical Practices Part 3 that addresses the IRB, the table of contents is responsibilities, composition, functions, operations, procedures, and records. And that's in your book also, and you're welcome to peruse that. Again, an IRB should safeguard the rights, safety, and well-being of all trial subjects. Special attention should be paid to trials that may include vulnerable subjects. This is again, continuing review of each ongoing trial must occur at intervals that are appropriate to the degree of risk, but at least once a year. I don't know if you can see this, but this is our Research and Education Institute continuing review form. It's a 2-page form. And that's included in your handouts as well. Fortunately, you can complete this online, but then you have to print it out and sign it. The IRB should perform its functions according to written operating procedures. They must maintain written records of their activities and should comply with good clinical practices. The investigator, again, may provide information on any aspect of the trial. He may be there during some of the initial explanation of the study, but they should not participate in the deliberations or in the votes of the IRB if they're involved in the trial. Okay, this just talks about retaining relevant records, written procedures, membership lists, lists of affiliation for all the members. The IRB may be asked by investigators, sponsors, or regulatory authorities to provide copies of its written procedures and membership lists. I know that we commonly provide the membership lists for this institution to our sponsors. I've not yet been asked to provide copies of the written procedures, but I'm sure that's happened. Here's a question that's come up a few times. Can the sponsor directly contact the IRB? Generally speaking, the main line of communication should be between the investigator and the IRB. However, the sponsor is not prohibited from contacting the IRB, and there are some circumstances where the communications may be more efficient if the sponsor does directly contact them. There might be issues regarding medical devices, or there are rare times when a sponsor contacts our compliance office directly. We're going to move on to investigators. Investigators have a wide range of responsibilities. They're kind of like the conductor of an orchestra, and they are accountable to quite a few people. They're accountable to their study subjects, the IRB, the institution, OHRP, the sponsor of the study. And for studies that are conducted under FDA jurisdiction, these responsibilities are outlined, some of these responsibilities are outlined on the FDA Form 1572. Fortunately, good clinical practices have helped to further define the role of the study investigator as distinct and apart from that of the primary care physician. This is a copy of the FDA Form 1572. The front part, box 1, includes the principal investigator's name and contact information. There's information about IRBs that will be used for the trial, any clinical laboratories, sites for recruitment and follow-up of subjects, sub-investigators, and this bottom box is the space for the title of the study and the sponsor study number. On the back are a list of responsibilities. You probably have read this when you've looked at a 1572, but these are the things that the investigator says that he will do. And this is a contract that the investigator signs with FDA, stating he will be responsible for these things. And he signs and dates it here. Whenever you change anything on the front, it needs to be re-signed and dated each time. Usually the original goes to the sponsor and you keep a copy. But it reflects any time you add a new nurse, maybe you add a new laboratory, you delete a sub-investigator. You have to sort of reissue these each time you make a major change in your study. These are some places where you can find good clinical practice guidelines for investigators and their responsibilities. A very basic question, and sometimes I hear some investigators trying to shirk this responsibility, but who is responsible? It is the PI. He's responsible for the integrity of the data and for the safety of the subjects. By signing an FDA Form 1572, it's a legally binding agreement with the federal government. And then finally, this is a concept that needs to be reiterated. Tasks can be delegated to others. You can have a great study coordinator and a recruiter and some data managers, but the real responsibility for the trial always rests with the PI. It can't be delegated. When you look at the Good Clinical Practice Guidelines developed by ICH, these are the topics that are covered. And again, a little bit further, informed consent, records and reports, progress reports. There's guidelines for all of the responsibilities of the investigator. Some of the important ones, the investigator should maintain a list of appropriately qualified people to whom the investigator has delegated significant trial-related duties. And I included here sort of a sample of a delegation form, and this has become fairly standard. Each person working on the study is listed here, their title, their signature, and then what their responsibilities are. And it could be collecting data, obtaining informed consent, performing phlebotomy, administering test medication, and you can just put those numbers in the box, and it just shows what each person is doing. There's also a question here, is this person listed on the 1572? This is a handy form to have. The investigator needs to be able to demonstrate, based on past experience and some retrospective data, that he's able to recruit the required number of subjects for this particular study within the agreed upon recruitment period. The investigator should have enough time to conduct and complete the study within the agreed trial period. He should have an adequate number of qualified staff and adequate facilities. And these are all things that a sponsor will come out and look at to make sure that the investigator is qualified. During and following a subject's participation in a trial, the investigator should ensure that adequate medical care is provided to a subject for any adverse events, including any significant laboratory results that are related to the trial. The investigator should inform a subject when medical care is needed for intercurrent illnesses. It's recommended that the investigator inform the subject's primary physician about the participation in the trial if the subject has a primary physician and if the subject agrees. The investigator should conduct the trial in compliance with the protocol, which was approved by the IRB. And in the ICH guideline, the ICH GCP guidelines, it does state that the investigator should sign the protocol or an alternative contract to confirm their agreement with the protocol. I remember when this first came about in the late 90s, they started asking us to sign the protocols, and that was kind of new at the time, but this is part of the Good Clinical Practice Guidelines. The investigator or a designated person needs to document and explain if there's any deviations from the approved protocol. The responsibility for the test product or the investigational medication or biologic really rests with the investigator. Again, that's a task that somebody else may do, but it ultimately rests with the investigator. Where allowed or required, the investigator or institution may assign some or all of the duties for investigational product accountability to a pharmacist or another appropriate individual who's under the supervision of the investigator or institution. And I guess that's going to become more important for us here as California has sort of adopted regulations to make sure that investigational products come through a research pharmacist. So we'll be seeing that more and more here. Let's go over what sponsors are. Sometimes people have a question about this, but it could be an individual, it could be a company, an institution, or an organization that takes responsibility for the initiation, management, and/or financing of a clinical trial. Sometimes you have studies where you have co-sponsors. I know I'm involved in one now. We have NIH as a sponsor, and we have an industry sponsor, which makes it very interesting. You can also have a sponsor investigator. Okay, this is an individual who initiates and conducts a clinical trial. And this person has a tremendous amount of responsibility. They have obligations that include both those of a sponsor and of an investigator. Sponsor good clinical practices can be found in Part 5 in your book. And these are some of the guidelines and where you can find them. Talks about responsibilities for quality assurance, relationship with a CRO, trial design, trial management, responsibilities for investigator selection, allocation of duties, compensation to both subjects and investigators, notifying regulatory authorities. GCPs also cover, of course, information about how the investigational product should be distributed, packaged, labeled, coded, record access, safety information, and reporting of adverse reactions. And then finally, this is quite a long section in the GCP guidelines, but it addresses monitoring, auditing, what happens in the event of noncompliance, what happens in the event of premature termination of a trial, clinical trial and study reports, and multi-center trials. Okay, just to go back to some of the ones that I think are important and should be pointed out under good clinical practices. This sponsor is responsible for retaining quality assurance and quality control systems with written standard operating procedures to make sure that the trials are conducted and the data are generated in compliance with the protocol, good clinical practices, and applicable regulatory requirements. Okay, so this falls under their purview as well. The sponsor may transfer any of their trial-related duties to a CRO, but the ultimate responsibility for the quality and integrity of the trial data always resides with the sponsor. Have all of you worked with a contract research organization? Pretty much, yeah. Okay. Sometimes you think they're in charge, but really it's the sponsor that has the ultimate responsibility. Any trial-related duty transferred and assumed by a CRO should be in writing. That's something we usually don't see as a site, but there is usually a written agreement about what the CRO will handle. The sponsor may consider establishing an independent data monitoring committee to oversee the progress of a trial, including safety data, critical efficacy endpoints at intervals, and to recommend to the sponsor whether to continue, modify, or stop a trial. The independent data monitoring committee should have written operating procedures and maintain written records of all of its meetings. And this is becoming more frequent as there's more concerns about conflict of interest, who's overseeing safety data. And this will be important when you have your session coming up on data and safety monitoring plans and reports that's given by Dr. Mao. You'll hear more about this. Okay, the sponsor is responsible for selecting qualified investigators. The sponsor should obtain the investigator or the institution's agreement not only to conduct the trial in compliance with GCP, but to comply with procedures for data recording and reporting, to permit monitoring, auditing, and inspection of records, to retain essential documents, and the sponsor and the investigator should sign the protocol or an alternative document to confirm this agreement. And as I said earlier, usually that's the protocol that's signed. The sponsor should not supply the institution or investigator with an investigational product until all of the required documentation is obtained. And just from being in research for such a long time, I can tell you we used to get shipments of investigational product early before we ever got our IRB approvals. And that's no longer acceptable. You must have all of your regulatory documents lined up before you can receive drug. The sponsor should ensure timely delivery of investigational products to the investigator. Maintain records that document the shipment, receipt, disposition, return, and destruction of the investigational product. And then take steps to ensure that the investigational product is stable over the period of time. It's the sponsor's responsibility to watch over, check to see if something's about to expire, and provide you with enough investigational product to carry you through the trial. The sponsor must maintain sufficient quantities of the product, as we said here, and maintain records of batch sample analyses and characteristics of the product. They are responsible for the ongoing safety evaluation of the investigational product. The sponsor should expedite reporting to all concerned investigators, the IRB, and the regulatory authorities of adverse drug reactions that are both serious and unexpected. Usually you see these in the form of an IND safety report or a MedWatch report that comes to you. The sponsor is responsible for making sure that all of their investigators who are working with that investigational product be fully informed of any adverse drug reactions that are both serious and unexpected. Okay, sponsors, of course, are responsible for monitoring a trial, and the purpose of the monitoring is to ensure not only that the rights and well-being of human subjects are protected, but that the reported trial data are accurate, complete, and verifiable from source documents, and of course that the conduct of the trial is in compliance with the currently approved protocol, amendments, good clinical practices, and all regulatory requirements. Sponsor monitoring good clinical practices can be found in these locations, and all of these are in your book. Monitors are appointed by the sponsor. The sponsor must ensure that the trials are adequately monitored. The sponsor can actually determine how often monitoring should take place, whether it's 100% monitoring, 20% monitoring, what are the key things that need to be monitored. Now, GCPs do address some monitor responsibilities as well. The monitors are to act as the main line of communication between the sponsor and the investigator. They must verify that the investigator has adequate qualifications and resources. And in regard to the investigational product, the monitor must make sure that the storage times and conditions are acceptable, that the product is given only to subjects who are eligible to receive it by inclusion-exclusion criteria, and that the receipt, use, and return of the investigational product at the trial sites are controlled and documented. I do remember times when we would return our own investigational product. More and more I see monitors coming in to return the product for you. Okay, monitors are also responsible for verifying that informed consent was obtained for each subject, ensuring that the investigator receives the current investigator brochure, all documents, and all supplies that are needed to conduct the study. They're responsible for ensuring that the investigator and the staff are adequately informed about the trial. And with regard to data, the monitor is responsible for making sure that data is accurately reported on the case report forms, that they're consistent with the source documents. This is one of the main functions that we see them perform. That adverse events have been captured, concomitant medications, and intercurrent illnesses are all reported. Monitor ensures that visits that the subjects have failed to attend, tests that are not conducted, and examinations that are not performed are clearly documented, perhaps in a memo to file. And the monitor ensures that the subject withdrawals and dropouts are reported and explained. They are to inform the investigator of entry errors on the case report form and ensure that the changes are made correctly, and that the changes are made by an individual who's authorized to initial the case report form changes for the investigator. And that's probably something that you need to put on your staff delegation form for that these individuals are able to change case report forms and make corrections. The monitor is responsible for determining whether or not all adverse events are appropriately reported within the time periods required by good clinical practices, the IRB, and the sponsor. And of course, determining whether or not the site has maintained their essential documents in their regulatory files. And then finally, sponsors do conduct audits. The audit is actually independent and separate from routine monitoring. And it should be to evaluate trial conduct and compliance with the protocol, standard operating procedures of the sponsor, good clinical practices, and the applicable regulatory requirements. Oftentimes, they're auditing not just the conduct of the study at the site, but the conduct of their designated personnel in working with the site. Okay, a couple more topics here. GCPs that talk about study initiation. Study initiation, the purpose is to review all requirements and procedures with the investigative staff to assure full understanding of the study, monitoring procedures, regulations, and other study requirements. The initiation of a study is usually done at the site or at an investigator meeting, but it also can be done by teleconference. Study initiation must be documented, must be retained in both the investigator and the sponsor regulatory file. These are some of the topics that should be included in your initiation visit. There should be a complete discussion of the protocol. What are the subject inclusion, exclusion criteria? How will patients be selected and identified? What are the procedures for adverse event reporting and safety monitoring? How to complete the case report forms and process them? What elements need to be in the regulatory file? How long documents need to be maintained? What the plan is for monitoring, how often and how many subjects will be monitored? What are the requirements for medical records and source document review? This is also a time when you may want to go over GCP regulations and guidelines. Sometimes an investigator or initiation meeting is a really good time for new researchers to learn about GCP regulations and investigational product management, how to store the product, how to dispense it. Where do we find these? Study initiation GCPs are found in these locations. You can use that for reference. Data collection. This is just a short overview of some of the data collection, good clinical practices. What is a case report form? It's a printed, optical, or electronic document that's designed to record all the protocol required information for each subject. And then importantly, what is a source document? And source documents are something that have really grown, I'd say, in the past 7 or 8 years. Source documents are the original document, data, and records. May include hospital records, clinic and office charts, lab results, lab notes, memoranda, subject diaries, pharmacy dispensing records, x-rays, copies of transcripts certified after verification as being accurate and complete. And really, it's the first place information is written about a subject who's participating in a study. Source documents are required for clinical trials. They should provide adequate support and verification for the case report form. They should be accurate and not differ appreciably from the case report form. And if they do differ appreciably, there should be a note to file about why they do differ. They must provide an audit trail for actions taken with the subjects, and the case report form may be the source document if stated in the protocol, although this seems to be sort of going by the wayside now. I rarely see case report forms being able to be used as a source document. I'm sure most of you know this, but just to go over again, if you have changes to a case report form, you can't obliterate the change. You have to just put a line through it, date it, and initial it, and if necessary, you need to explain somewhere why the change was made. But you can't obscure the original entry, and that's because they would like to have an audit trail available. Sponsors should have a written procedure to assure that changes or corrections in the case report forms made by the sponsor designated representatives are documented. Sometimes sponsors will have some minor data change agreements that you can sign, simple things like spelling or some very small data points, and they need to have a procedure in place about what they can and cannot change on a case report form. Upon request of the monitor, auditor, IRB, or regulatory authority, the investigator should make available all requested trial-related records. Okay, here are the guidelines for data collection. There's quite a few places you can find them. Within the ICH guidelines in your book, they appear in many areas under records and reports, under safety reporting, trial management, data handling and record keeping, and under audits. One more note here, essential documents should be retained until at least 2 years after the last approval of a marketing application in an ICH region. And that's a little bit hard to figure out if you think about it, because it includes the European Union and Japan. So you may be holding on to your records for quite some time. The Vaccine Center, which is our group, we completed a very, very large efficacy trial in 1991 of a vaccine. We are now going through a lot of questioning and perhaps some auditing, because the product is now being submitted for licensure in Japan 10, 12 years later, and our memories are not that good. So you have to hold on to your records for a long time. It is the responsibility of the sponsor to inform the investigator when these documents no longer need to be maintained. I would say if you're even considering destroying your documents, you better contact your sponsor. They might have a nice way for you to store them. They might be able to scan them into a document archival system. Okay, that's going to be it today. If you have questions about good clinical practices, whether it's something we talked about today or next week, just write them on the card. You can put them in the box, or you can email me.